At an auction in 1832, a man named Joseph Thomson managed to sell his wife for 20 shillings and a dog. In his preamble, he listed her positives. She can read novels, milk cows, and make butter, as well as acknowledging some of her less desirable qualities. She cannot make rum, gin, or whiskey, but she is a good judge from long experience in tasting them. Even back then, many people would have been outraged at such events. They were by no means the norm, but it was true that women had very little legal standing in British courts. Unregulated industrial expansion may have hurled Britain into the position of the most powerful nation on the planet, but it had done so through exploiting and degrading many people both in Britain and around the world. The same year that this wife auction took place, 1832, the government passed the Great Reform Act. It allowed more people a voice in politics, still only men, and then only 1 in 5 of them, but it was a start. Government was finally accepting its responsibility to govern. The soldiers of the French Revolution may have been beaten on the battlefield, but the ideas they fought for, liberty, equality and fraternity, were more bulletproof. The British government had to contend with intermittent social unrest from groups like the Luddites and the Anti-Corn Law League, but the biggest threat came from a group called the Chartists. In 1848, they planned a demonstration that so alarmed the authorities, Queen Victoria was evacuated from London. At their heart, these instances of social unrest were reactions to the suffering caused by rapid and unregulated industrialization. For example, the newly built factories in Britain required workers, and those workers required homes. Without government regulations, landlords and factory owners were happy just to build cheap housing with little or no thought given to sanitation. Almost all of the houses in the largest towns across Britain were crowded, usually with 5 or more people living in one room. These people were living in squalor and disease was rife. The biggest 3 killers were smallpox, typhoid and cholera. In 1840, 1 child in every 3 died before they reached 5 years old, and the average age of death for a working class man in Manchester was 17. But education and democracy were beginning to reduce the hardships of industrialization. In 1854, a doctor named John Snow used statistical mapping to show that cholera was a waterborne disease. A few years later, following several weeks of the Great Stink in London, caused by unusually hot weather and the absence of proper sewage facilities, an engineer named Joseph Bazalgette was commissioned by a more democratically accountable government to create a sewer system capable of removing 1.9 billion litres of sewage a day. After the 1860s, councils began to clean up their towns and cities. Clean water supplies and sewers were installed. Better housing were built too. The healthier towns included wider lit streets and parks for the public to use. The increase in schooling also improved literacy rates. Now people could read booklets giving advice about health, diet, cleaning, childcare and care of the sick. People began to lead healthier lives. British surgeon Joseph Lister's creation of antiseptic led to the number of deaths from operations dropping from 6 in 10 to 1 in 10. All this contributed to Britain's population reaching 37 million by 1900. Prison reform alongside milder punishments were leading to fewer repeat offenders, and the early 20th century saw the first steps towards the creation of a welfare state with the introduction of national insurance and old age pensions. During this period, Britain was seen as the workshop of the world, producing many of the world's manufactured goods. It meant Britons were responsible for a number of world-first inventions such as electric generators, telephones and the light bulb, as well as scientific advancements like Charles Darwin's On the Origin of the Species. Being at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution also allowed Britain a head start in dominating different regions of the world. Having an empire was extremely profitable. It allowed for the acquisition of raw materials and riches from different regions, which could then be sold back to those regions as manufactured goods. Britain's empire became the largest the world has ever seen. Sometimes this growth came about through outright conflict, such as the Opium Wars with China in the 1840s, but at other times places were keen to associate closely with Britain, even if they never became part of the empire itself, like Peru. Much controversy still surrounds the British Empire. Many Britons at the time believed that what they were doing was right, bringing technology, education and enlightened thinking to many parts of the world. Queen Victoria herself declared that it was both the duty and the burden of the British to protect the poor natives and advance civilization. But technological superiority was often taken as proof of racial superiority, that indigenous populations, especially darker skinned ones, were inferior, at best to be treated as children who didn't know what was good for them. As other countries began catching up with Britain industrially, including newly formed ones like Italy and Germany, they rushed to build their own empires in competition with the British. This was most famously seen in the scramble for Africa, which led to the suffering of millions of Africans as well as growing tensions between European powers. Whilst Britain had largely avoided involvement in Europe since defeating Napoleon in 1815 at Waterloo, only committing troops in the Crimean War in the 1850s, the poor performance in the Boer Wars led to the desire to seek out allies. Empire building and the formation of alliances, together with a huge build-up in weaponry, explosively combined to become major causes for the First World War. The rapid expansion of the British Empire was in part due to the success of the railways, and they had a huge impact domestically as well. The first commercial railway locomotive was Stephenson's Rocket in 1830, which operated between Liverpool and Manchester. 50 years later, 300,000 people worked in jobs that depended on the railway. The railways affected people's lives in many far-reaching ways. It changed people's diets, allowing more fresh vegetables and dairy products into towns and cities. It created new towns, the village of Crewe jumping from a population of 203 to 18,000 in just 30 years. The railways even changed how people measured time. Previously, time had been measured locally according to the position of the sun. This meant that Bristol was 10 minutes behind London and Norwich a few minutes ahead. The need for a standard time so that timetables could actually work meant Greenwich Mean Time was adopted. By 1901, there were over 32,000 kilometres of train track that carried millions of passengers every year. London even had its own underground railway, the Tube, that took workers from growing suburbs into the city. The growth of railways meant that ordinary people were able to take day trips to coastal towns like Blackpool, Brighton and Margate. The British tradition of a day at the seaside was born. Hotels, amusement arcades, piers and promenades were built to entertain the thousands of day trippers who began to appear. In 1841, a man called Thomas Cook set up a company offering organised or packaged holidays. That company continued serving British holidaymakers for the next 178 years. In fact, this period saw the birth of many high street shops and department stores that people are familiar with today. High-speed travel meant sports clubs could now play teams from other towns in away games. This allowed for the standardisation of rules and the creation of governing bodies. County Championship cricket, lawn tennis and rugby union were all launched during this period, but no sport had as big an impact as football. It required very little equipment and could be played in all weathers, meaning even the poor could afford to play, which is why it became known as the People's Game. The FA Cup final of 1901 had a crowd of over 110,000 in attendance. By the 1850s, more people were working shorter hours, were home earlier in the evenings and had time off on Sundays and also Saturday afternoons. In 1871, Parliament introduced bank holidays. With more leisure time available, people found new ways with which to spend it. Hobbies such as photography, comic book reading, cycling and roller skating became familiar sights. Popular authors like Jane Austen, Lewis Carroll and George Eliot saw their novels sold in the thousands by an ever-growing literate population. Attendance at theatre and music halls soared. Some music hall performers became the superstar celebrities of their day, like singer Marie Lloyd. Of course, alcohol and visiting pubs was still very popular, but there was also a trend of business leaders, many of whom were Quakers, to encourage workers to avoid such unhealthy habits. Perhaps the most well-known example of this was the model village of 300 houses around the Bourneville factory in Birmingham, built by the Cadbury brothers for their workers. The village had a swimming pool, bowling green, football, cricket and hockey pitches, but not a pub in sight. Other philanthropic individuals and organisations began to appear at this time, including Lord Shaftesbury, whose memorial statue is in Piccadilly Circus, Thomas Bernardo, whose organisation helped rescue over 50,000 homeless people by the time he died, and William Booth, who founded the Salvation Army. And the march towards equality for women began to gather momentum. It had only been in 1884 that Parliament finally ruled that a wife was not owned by her husband, ending any possibility of future wife auctions. 34 years later, in large part due to the suffragist movement, women were extended the vote. In addition, the 19th century saw divorces become more accessible and alimony payments became compulsory. Trailblazing women inspired others and refuted the notion women were intellectually inferior to men. Florence Nightingale and Mary Sokol in nursing, Elizabeth Fry in penal reform, and Marian Evans in literature. On top of all these reforms, there were some calls for self-government in Scotland and Wales, but the desire for home rule was most passionately called for in Ireland. There, centuries-old British laws still restricted many freedoms for Catholics, and most Irish peasants were Catholic. When a disease that destroyed the harvest of the number one crop in Ireland, the potato, appeared in the late 1840s, many Irish people felt the British government did not do enough to help. The Great Hunger, as it became known, saw 1 million people die of starvation and another million leave for a new life in America. By 1871, 1/4 of New York's population was Irish. Ireland's population today is still less than it was in 1840. The march towards home rule became inevitable and would have happened sooner had the First World War not got in the way. This period begins with the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. With peace on the continent and control of the seas, Britain was able to extend its influence abroad. But that influence often came at the cost of suffering for millions of others, both nearby and further afield. Though social change in Britain did begin to gather momentum after the Great Reform Act was passed in 1832. Advances in technology like the railway was matched by advances in science like Darwin's On the Origin of the Species. Still, tensions between European powers, as well as the poor performance in the Boer War, encouraged Britain to seek allies and eventually dragged them into the First Great Powers War for a century.